This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here, we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited to get to speak with Anne Fadiman. Anne is professor in the practice of English and Francis Writer in residence at Yale. Her writing interests include literary journalism, essays, memoir, and autobiography. She has received the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Review for Current Interest, and the Salon Book Award. And congratulations on your latest book. This book, titled Frog, is a collection of essays, and it's not your first. Can you tell us about how a collection of essays come to be? I'm thinking especially because I think the essay form is really attractive to a lot of academics.
Sure. Well, let me give that a try at least. First of all, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. And I should say that I'm probably different from most academics, partly because I'm so underqualified. I have nothing beyond a BA, which means I have fewer degrees than every single person who is listening to your podcast at the moment. I'm just a writer, and I started off as a journalist. I didn't start off as an essayist. And until I was in my early 40s, every single thing I published was something that I'd reported, or I guess 98%. I wrote a few book reviews, but never published an essay. And I found my way into the essay form only because of a problem pregnancy in my early 40s. I had to spend 8 months in bed, and it was either more book reviews, I'd already done that, or let's try essays. And I'd never published an essay, but I decided I would give it a whirl. I obviously wasn't going to be doing any reporting from my bed. And then after my son was born and everything was fine and I was vertical again, although I wouldn't have wanted to do reporting far afield, well, we were living in New York City. There might have been one or two local pieces I might have found, but I had fallen in love with the essay. So I've written 3 collections, and the first 2 came into being because I was writing, in each case, an ongoing column for a periodical, first for Civilization, the magazine of the Library of Congress, now sadly extinct with both a capital C and sometimes I think also a small c. And then the next one for the American Scholar, a magazine that I used to edit. So I had a kind of guaranteed publication through these periodicals once the column had started, and had a long relationship with my publisher. And so I was very fortunate that I was able to stick with the same publisher to produce the essay collections. But this third one is a little different. I wasn't writing a column for a magazine. I had the luxury of simply devoting most of my summers for a number of years to whatever I was obsessed with at the time, in a kind of serial monogamy, while being able to put ramen on the table through my work in the other 9 months as a teacher.
Great. I was thinking about how there's some irony to the fact that your first book, which is a very highly praised, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, and the subtitle is, I think, Among Child, Her American Doctors and the Collision of Two Cultures. I remember, by the way, all my friends in med school were reading this in the first decade of the 21st century.
Thank you.
That book takes as its subject a culture and a history that I think might seem really distant and unfamiliar to many readers, but much of your writing, which is in the essay form, treats what we might consider the very familiar. And to give readers an idea, one of the chapters in this most recent book is titled My Old Printer. I love that title. And then there's also an essay called Frog, which is about a family pet, which just made me wonder how you understand your work as an essayist, or maybe when you're explaining to your students about what it means to write essays.
Sure. Well, first of all, my first book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, which was a reported account of a medical case that turned out badly between a Hmong refugee family in California and their American doctors. wasn't just about an unfamiliar culture, that of the Hmong. It was also about a second culture, that of American medicine. And it took me almost 9 years to do this book, though I did have a couple of kids along the way. I always find that when my male colleagues take 8 or 9 years to write a book, they write a 600-page biography. And when my female colleagues take 8 or 9 years to write a book, they write a 300-page book and have two children. And I was in the second category. But in any case, it was about two cultures. And when I began, I thought of Hmong culture as extremely unfamiliar and medical culture as not even a culture. That was just part of my world. And as the years went on, I would say that the strange became familiar and the familiar became strange. I got so close to the Hmong family that their lives started to seem quite normal to me, including animal sacrifices and animism. But medical culture started to seem more and more peculiar. So I guess I'm always interested in the notion of the strange and familiar changing places. And in this latest collection, it's true that some of the essays are about apparently familiar subjects, but I hope that they seem stranger by the time you finish reading the essay. So a good example is the title essay, 6,000 words about a deceased pet frog. You wouldn't think you could wring that many words out of such a small subject, but I started thinking about things like, what is a pet? Do you need to be able to pet a pet? What if the relationship isn't reciprocal and you have a pet that that's a poor hiking companion because it's a frog, that doesn't come to the door to greet you, it doesn't snuggle on your lap when you watch TV because you can't take it out of its aquarium. In other words, a frog that barely notices that you exist, but that in our case happened to live for either 16 or 17 years. We're not quite sure which, but Bunky was essentially immortal. So, what do you owe a pet like this? And as I wrote the essay, I decided I owed a pet of this sort, an unpettable pet who entered our family by accident. I owed him a lot more than we gave him, in particular, a lot more than I gave him. So, it's an essay about shame and guilt and how my sense of guilt over having never gotten Bunky a larger aquarium, though I intended to do so for years. It's not the worst sin in the world, but in my view, it's actually a sin. And in order to examine that, I hope that I made some readers look a little bit more carefully about the pets that they've owned and the challenges and obligations of parenthood in order to complicate something that had previously seemed so simple that it was beneath our notice. And several of the essays in this book are, I would say, in that category.
I wonder how you decide when a subject is worthy of an essay. Is it that you can't stop thinking about it, or you're sort of starting to write it in your head?
Yeah, I mean, if it comes into the shower with me and if it's in bed with me when I'm trying to fall asleep and is keeping me awake, that's the next essay.
And I'm assuming because you're a human writer that there are subjects or writing projects that you've started to write and maybe haven't finished, as happens to all of us. But do you have an understanding of like why that happens when it does, or what makes you push on with subjects?
I've never started to write something, or at least an essay, that I haven't finished. However, I've often done preliminary research for things that I haven't written. I've made notes. I've accumulated fat manila folders full of clippings. In other words, all the things, all the phases that I go through before I set pen to paper, aside from the really sort of the last complex phases of outlining and doing more notes and more reading when I'm sure that I'm going to write something. But I've never actually started to write something that I haven't finished along the lines of an essay. I certainly have a number of ideas that I haven't yet done and I may never do. This could be my last collection of essays because I'm 72 and I have a couple of other book ideas that I'm incredibly lucky to be able to finish, and neither of those is an essay collection. So I might have finished my last essay collection, but I'm clearly drawn to the essay. Only today, for example, perhaps I will regret this later, but right now I'm really excited about it. I had told myself, okay, no more essays, no more essays, got to start in the next book. But just today, I got an email from one of my colleagues at Yale who is going to edit a book of essays on Virginia Woolf and asked me to write an essay on teaching Virginia Woolf. There's one particular essay of hers I've been teaching for a long time. And 1 year I taught at Yale's London program and got to take my students to the place where the essay was written. And as soon as my colleague sent me this email, I thought, don't say yes, don't say yes. Yes. So it was absolutely irresistible. And so I also have, some other ideas of things that I really would like to write. And, if I could live to be 120 or 130 years old, I'm sure I'd get around to all of them.
It is really interesting, though, that you've, that you always, it sounds like, push on with the essays. What do you think that is? Is it the knowing, all right, this isn't that long anyway, and I've already done the research, and you're obviously someone who's very excited about your writing. How do you get through it all?
Well, this Virginia Woolf essay is going to be short, and it's something that I've already been thinking about and something that I feel very joyful about because I love Virginia Woolf. I love teaching Virginia Woolf. Taking my students to Monk's house was really, where she wrote The Death of the Moth, was really magical. So it's partly that I felt that much of the work of the essay was already done and it hadn't been work, it was play. But with the other essays, they were all on subjects that for one reason or another, I was just kind of madly in love with. And so, unlike an academic, standard academic who needs to perhaps get tenure, carve out a deeper niche in her subspecialty. I have the luxury of writing about whatever I want, and also have the luxury of knowing that I will probably find a magazine or literary journal who will publish the essay, and then knowing that when I get enough, that my longtime publisher, Farrar, Straus and Giroux, will probably publish them in book form, and at that point I'll have a chance to revise them. And I did a lot of revision in all of these pieces and made them better. So I have certain luxuries that I wouldn't have had at the beginning of my career, and certain luxuries that I wouldn't have if I were a standard academic. And I am grateful for those luxuries because it means I can entertain myself with my topics and write about what I want to read.
Yeah, I mean, that luxury you talk about, I guess it is one that, I mean, some academics post tenure or post getting full professor feel they have a degree of that, which is why one of the reasons I felt hearing from you would be interesting to our many listeners who are thinking, well, what do I want to write about now that I maybe have the luxury to follow my interests? You mentioned moving between essays and sort of bigger projects. I'm curious, when you're in the book writing, the non-essay writing, do you really try to clear your deck of essays and need to spend just sort of months focused on the book or whatever the bigger project is, or can you go back and forth?
No, no, I'm really bad at multitasking. I mean, of course, like all teachers, I have to multitask, but I do almost all my writing in the summers, whether it's an essay collection, which I wrote over a period of years, or the book that I sort of wrote in the middle of the collection, or I guess sort of closer to the beginning. But I stopped writing essays when I wrote my last book, which is a memoir about my father. When I'm, whether it's an essay or something book length, I have to focus only on that one thing. I'm monogamous. I am not polyamorous, except serially.
Mhm.
And definitely not into one night, 1 week, or even 1 month stands. I have to devote my heart and brain and really soul entirely to whatever I'm writing about if it has any chance of being half decent.
And since you mentioned that you're teaching during the school year, mostly doing your writing this summer, is there writing going on during the academic year, or are there ways in which teaching is feeding your writing at all?
Yeah, I don't do much writing at all during the academic year. I sometimes revise, and there have been times when I was writing the memoir about my father, The Wine Lover's Daughter. There certainly were times when I had to write during the school year, but I rented a little one-room cabin that I could tell you a little more about if we want to talk about writing process. And over a winter, I would often go up there on the weekend. But the whole setup there was designed to shut out the rest of my life so I could pretend that all of my other obligations and commitments didn't exist, though they'd all be screaming for me when I came home on Sunday night. Yeah, I'm just not very good at juggling things. That is, I can do it, but the quality of my work really suffers when I do. But that makes it sound as if writing is my first priority and teaching my second. I would say that whatever I'm doing, I try to devote all my attention to. I absolutely love teaching, and I've taught both semesters a year, every semester except for one since 2005. So when I'm doing that, my students occupy my full attention and they are absolutely incredible. And it's not just that I don't want my teaching to take my focus away from my writing. I don't want my writing to take my focus away from my teaching. But I'm very fortunate that because I'm not a scholar, I don't have a project to work on every summer that is in a fairly narrow field of specialty and that I have to get into the such and such university press. I'm working on my essays or my books. And fortunately, that's just what my employer, Yale University, wants its creative writing teachers to do. That is, our mandate is to keep on writing the kind of stuff that made them hire us in the first place, rather than become deeper or more expert in an increasingly narrow niche.
It's interesting to hear that during the school year you're kind of okay with not much of or if any of my own personal writing going on. I know
Yeah.
many academics feel they start to feel a little itchy or something or not good about not doing their writing, but it sounds like this is very fulfilling, the teaching and the relationships with students.
Oh, God, I love my students, but I also know that I'm contributing a heck of a lot more to American literature by teaching these particular students than I would if I quit my job at Yale and, churned out an extra 2 books, before I die or my cognitive abilities lapse. Many of my students become writers, and, 4 of them have won Pulitzer Prizes and so on. And it's not that they won those Pulitzers because I taught them. I was one of many way stations for them, but I was an encouraging way station and may have helped them in one way or another. And their minds are so exciting to me, and they are so inspiring to me. They also keep me from becoming one of those hermit like older writers who really doesn't know what's happening in the world anymore because, they're just in their little attic study and they don't really know anybody young. And they tend to keep on doing the same kinds of things that they've always done well in the past rather than opening themselves up to things that are newer or weirder. And in this book, there are some subjects and forms and so on that I hadn't tried before that I never would have come to if it hadn't been for my students. It's not that my students keep me young, it's that they keep me open. And that is really important. old people can't become set in their ways. Otherwise, no one will want to keep reading them. They'll just want to keep reading their earlier books, which were similar but probably better. If I couldn't let new ideas and feelings and ways of looking at the world and ways of writing into my life, why would anyone want to buy a book of mine or even check it out from a library?
And I was going to ask you about teaching, but as I was reading this book, Frog, I was also reminded in your writing how you might have a very special kind of student. It sounds like the students who take your creative writing classes are very motivated. They know they want to be writers of some sort. And not all of us teach undergraduates like that. But still, your writing made it clear that you sometimes have to motivate students. I'm just curious about your bag of tricks, since we all, as professors, have to have them. What have you done to try to get students more into writing?
Well, if they weren't into writing, they wouldn't apply to my classes. And I'm just an incredibly lucky teacher in that, like almost all of Yale's creative writing teachers, I get many more applications to my class than I can take on. So, especially one of my classes is called Writing About Oneself. I mean, if you were 21 years old, what could be more fascinating? What could seem more universal? Far more universal, let's say, than writing about the universe. If my class were called that, wouldn't get nearly as many applications. So that class usually gets about, I don't know, 100 or so applications for 12 places. And so I'm taking the people that I want. I haven't met these students, but each one writes a letter to me and I see writing samples and I'm just really thrilled by their voices and I can't wait to meet them. And they are really motivated. They don't all want to become writers. Some of them are very clear that they want to be doctors or lawyers and just write on the side. They usually do continue writing outside their chosen field in some way, but writing isn't their main thing. And if they got a great voice, I still take them. There are no prerequisites and they don't have to be English majors. Really, all I care about is their voices. So I don't really have to motivate them very much. But they motivate each other. That is, they tend to develop really close relationships. On the first day of class, we all take a vow of confidentiality. We all can read everybody's essays on our password protected class server, but people promise not to share them with friends, not even the topics. It makes students able to write about very personal things that they could never publish, feeling that their confidentiality will be protected. And that sense of sharing secrets and sharing vulnerability creates a real sense of intimacy. The students are trying to live up to each other's standards. It's not that they're competing with each other. It's just that the person to their left wrote such an amazing essay and worked so hard and was willing to be so revealing. They feel that they need to reciprocate and step up to the plate. So I would say that their mutual supportiveness and the fact that they're also good and so kind and so varied and so non-competitive, that's the main motivation. I mean, I think I have a few other things to teach them, at least I hope, but in terms of motivation, I'm more like the coach, but they're the teammates without whom they wouldn't be motivated at all. No coach can motivate a team whose members don't love each other and wish to collaborate as a group.
Yeah, I wonder, does that mean stepping back a bit so that they I like that metaphor of you as the coach and them really feeling each other as teammates to cheer on and, sort of applaud their work. I'm just trying to think of how we create that feeling in the classroom.
I don't step back at all. I just step back in terms of not explicitly trying to motivate them. One of the things I do, most professors would consider demotivating, which is that I encourage them if they are able to take the class pass fail, or as they call it at Yale, which I know you're an alum of, credit D fail. In other words, if they're good writers, I want them to be able to find out whether they can make deadlines and do good work without external validation, because they'll need it in the writing world, but also to access more joy and less dread and more ability to take risks and try new things that they might not perform very well at first time. So the first thing I do is take away the most standard motivator, which is the grade, because usually at least half the class chooses to take it credit, including some people whom I would have given a straight A to. I also spent a lot of time with each student. I meet with each student individually for an hour every other week, so 6 times over the course of the semester. And we go over their latest essay, or as far as we get, line by line in my office, sitting together in front of my computer. And we have a very set format. And at the end of the hour, they have to look at the changes that we've made together and come up with what I call the personal pitfalls list. That is, what did I not do as well as I might have liked in this sense or in this sense, and in this sense? And they have to come up with a category name so they can try to avoid it the next time. That's just one of many things about the format of the class that are the opposite of my stepping back, but they don't have to do with sort of standard carrot and stick motivating tools. I have very few sticks, and the carrots, the carrots are. Let's see how to find the right metaphor here. The students give each other a lot of carrots, but I try to help the students find internal carrots, which sounds like a form of auto cannibalism. But what I really mean is to find that they actually enjoy writing and are excited by it instead of being afraid of it, as most young writers and many adult writers are at every level.
You are speaking about that kind of internal excitement for writing, makes me wonder if this is something you picked up in part in the home. You are, I think, the child of 2 writers, and your father, Clifton Fadiman, is someone who I'm meeting all the time in my own research of mid-century, middlebrow culture. It seems like he did everything that was possible to do in that literary scene in terms of he was a senior editor at Simon and Schuster. He was a critic at The New Yorker. He was a host on radio and television quiz shows. I'm curious what you feel what you learned from him as a writer.
Well, he wasn't just senior editor. He was actually the editor in
Oh, okay.
Simon Schuster when he was 28.
Wow.
So, and my mother, I would say, I learned at least as much from. She, during most of World War II, was the only woman war correspondent in China. So my sort of reporting hat, which I wore until my early 40s, and which I'll probably resume at some point, was entirely from her. And then I'm now sitting in a library writing an essay and thinking about dead writers. That hat is inherited from my father. Although, I take a dim view of the notion of inheritance, because to think that your interests and abilities are only inherited suggests that you don't actually have any of your own. It's the difference between living in a nice house because you inherited a lot of money from your parents, and actually doing well in your own occupation enough to buy that nice house. And I hope that in some of my writing, I've actually, at least could afford the down payment on my own literary houses. One of the essays in this book is called The Oakling and the Oak, and it's about the eldest son of the great early 19th century British poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And Hartley Coleridge was also a poet, and you're really kind of screwed if you're a poet and your father is the greatest poet in the world. Uh, and the title of that essay, The Oakling and the Oak, comes from a review of the only book of poetry Hartley published in his lifetime. And it said that he has inherited some of his father's genius. Didn't say he had any of his own, but it said, we must never forget the old adage that the oakling always withers beneath the shadow of the oak. And I got very interested in what I think of now as oaklings, the literary offspring of literary parents, and what makes some oaklings wither, but what makes some thrive, and what was it about the oaks who were towering above me? I wasn't going to be the editor-in-chief at Simon and Schuster at the age of 28. I mean, I was even more than a decade away from publishing my first book at 28. What enabled enough light to come through those tall branches so that I didn't wither? Part of it, I think, growing up with writer parents, there are some benefits. They're between the two of them. They had about 7,000 books. They very rarely said, okay, here's a book you should read. They were just on the shelves and I could take them down, whatever I wanted, appropriate, inappropriate, pornographic, over my head, whatever, there they were, simply for me to sample as I willed. And I could also see that it was possible to make a living as a writer. So, but I didn't have to be extremely creative to choose the field. I'd grown up with it. It was sort of like going into the family used car business. My parents never sat me down and said, okay, let's go over your latest high school paper and, I'm going to criticize it and then your next one would be better. I think that they understood that that would be deflating rather than helpful. And they pretty much withheld their criticism and just said, oh, that's really great. And I have a feeling that they had to do a fair amount of work to hold their tongues consciously, because I'm sure that they thought of many things that could be better. Once I started publishing, I never showed them any of my work until after it was published. It needed to feel entirely my own. But on the other hand, the conversation around the Fadiman dinner table was the kind that without effort would make any child get an 800 on at least on their verbal SAT, or at least a perfect score in the vocabulary section. I didn't have to learn any of those things. It was more a matter of osmosis. So I wouldn't say that my father or my mother consciously taught us a whole lot. I think what they did was model it and surround us with an exceptionally word-filled, word play-filled, and book and magazine-filled atmosphere that we just drank in. It was our oxygen. We never thought about it. It just was.
Yeah, it came through in your writing that it was very in the air. And I guess I really identified with the way grammar and syntax and things, like my father being like, I think my dad would always say, children are reared and not raised. Like, you're not supposed to use certain words in these incorrect ways, or you don't feel nauseous, you feel nauseated. These things that some of our parents felt very strongly about.
Some of our parents did feel very strongly about those things. Yes, I guess I maybe was taught those things. If I made a grammatical mistake, my father would correct me. That's true.
One thing that's changed, I imagine, over your career, and certainly since your parents were writing, is just kind of publishing and selling books. We've interviewed several people on this podcast who've talked about it being a not great time for nonfiction trade books at the moment. I'm curious if this is something you or through your students have felt, or what's your view on this moment in publishing?
Oh, I don't know. I think it is a not great time, but it's a not great time in a variety of ways. And I guess if you're, writing speculative fiction romance novels with gold deckled pages, it might be a really great time. But the kinds of things that I write, most of my students write, probably not a great time. But on the other hand, many of my former students have published in all genres and have done extremely well. And several have gotten on the New York Times bestseller list with their nonfiction works. Some of them reported, some not, some memoirs. So I think in general, it's a tough time, but I'm not sure I have any particular advice. Most of my students, although it's a much tougher atmosphere for them than it was for me when I got out of college in the mid 70s and started my own career, but most of them are following more or less the same path. It's just rockier and narrower for them. That is, they often start off either writing for periodicals or being on the staff of a periodical. More of them do MFAs. I mean, I did not do an MFA, nor did I go to journalism school or any kind of graduate school. And some of the ones who do MFAs in nonfiction have the draft of a book by the time they finish the program and have indeed then sold that book. And that's not just nonfiction, that's also fiction and poetry. So that's a new path. Well, for example, tomorrow I go down to Washington, D.C., where I will be doing a reading at a bookstore that I have read at before that I love, Politics and Prose, and having an onstage conversation with one of my former students, Isaac Arnsdorf, who is on the White House reporting team of the Washington Post. And he's written one book and co-written another, both bestsellers, and both the first one about the MAGA movement, Finish What We Started, and this second one, 2024, which he co-wrote about all of the 2024 campaigns. And he's a political writer who, when he's writing for the front page of the Post, can't put his full style and voice into play, but can when he writes books. And so he gets to be his full self. On the other hand, he probably wouldn't have gotten that first book contract unless he were a staff writer at the Washington Post. And the Post has given him some sabbaticals and other time off because he's such a valued member of their staff. On the downside, two of my former students are recently fired from the Washington Post in their recent purge, one from the sports department, and the other one from the books department, because their entire departments were dissolved. So some are doing well, some less well. But that was my track, starting off writing magazine articles, first freelance, and then as a staff writer at Life magazine, and coming to books only somewhat later. It still is possible, and it certainly is still possible to be an academic who is writing works on the side for an intelligent general audience, whether they're personal essays or non-academic criticism. There are a lot of good literary journals out there, and those academics have the great advantage of not having to make a living from their writing. And so they, like me, might be able to write about the things that are obsessing them in the shower and in bed.
I imagine maybe some of your colleagues at Yale who don't have the publishing history that you have wonder or ask you for advice on how they can get more popular pieces published, either sort of magazine pieces, newspaper, or more popular books. What do you advise academics who are wanting to publish outside of the academic press?
I don't get those questions very often from my colleagues, but I get them a lot from my students and my alumni. Oh, I don't know. I have a list, for example, of journals that publish the good literary journals. And I used to edit a literary magazine, so I'm interested in these little journals that publish personal essays and with various links and how to submit. But some of them they read only twice a year, and you have to fit in this little window because they only have a staff of three or whatever. So I do that. When they say, "How do I get an agent?" I always say, "I have absolutely no idea." That is, in my long life as a writer, I've had only two agents, and the first was a poker partner or a boss in a part-time job, and then the second one was an old friend of one of my colleagues at the American Scholar. So, I but I also think that if you write something really good, agents will take you on. And agents will often take, especially younger writers, on if they feel they have an interesting future. They've written three exciting pieces for magazines and journals. They have a real voice. They seem really smart. They have a good book idea. And even if nobody's heard of them, often they will be taken on by an agent. So if I lost my current agent, I would be more likely to ask my former students for advice, and they'd probably be able to give me good advice, much better than I could give to, unfortunately, to some of the people who might listen to this podcast. If you would sit in my office for an hour, I might be able to help you write a better sentence, but I wouldn't be able to help you find an agent. On the other hand, writing a better sentence might help you find an agent.
True. There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one is, what is something you wish you could tell your younger self about writing or publishing?
I would tell my younger self, someday you will stop procrastinating. You will. It will happen. You don't have to worry that you're going to carry this millstone around your neck for the rest of your life as a writer. You will stop procrastinating. It will happen not because you will that into being, but because you start to love writing and because it seems somewhat lower stakes. And once you start looking forward to writing instead of dreading it, why procrastinate? You'll just get to it. And if I had known that that was going to be coming, the thing that really dogged me in college and for quite a few years after, even if I didn't know exactly when it was coming, if I'd known it was coming, you're going to love writing. You're going to totally stop procrastinating. You're going to be like, an AA member who doesn't even, have a creme de menthe souffle ever again for the rest of their life. If somebody just told me that, that would have been really encouraging. So, yeah, I wish my younger self could have heard that.
Does that mean, I don't know if you're a morning writer or whenever you...
No.
Okay.
Only when I've stayed up all night and I'm still writing in the morning. I mean, I see dawn only from the end of night angle. Yeah, I have a really nocturnal circadian rhythm, and I'm married to a writer, George Howe Colt, who has the opposite rhythm. I'm an owl, and he is a lark, and he will never change, and I will never change. We have many, many other things in common. Thank heaven, because it really is sometimes as if we are on radically different time zones.
Can I ask you about the process? I mean, is there any warm up when you're writing? How do you get into it?
Well, the most important process I have is basically subtracting everything from my life but my writing. Earlier, I mentioned a little cabin that I sometimes rent. So when I say little, I mean little. It has one room. It's about 15 by 15 feet, maybe 16 by 16. I once brought up a tape measure. It's sitting in the meadow behind a farmhouse owned by two writers that I know, and it doesn't have internet. It doesn't have cell service. It doesn't have a landline. Doesn't have a radio. It doesn't have a TV set, and it doesn't have hot water. It also doesn't have a bathroom. In order to use a bathroom, I have to walk to the farmhouse, which is several minutes walk. I can get internet in the bathroom, and I have to sit on the toilet holding my laptop, which isn't really very conducive to spending a whole lot of time web surfing. So I usually bring it in there for about 15 minutes a day. In other words, the cabin has nothing except my work and a beautiful view of a meadow out a large picture window. It has everything I need and nothing else. So instead of adding complicated practices from my life, I simply have removed every conceivable distraction. And because I really love writing now, it's about 45 minutes from my home. And when I've rented it for, let's say, a stretch in the summer, my heart is just singing as I drive up Route 116 from where I live, from Whately through Conway and Ashfield to Buckland, Massachusetts. And I always have the same plastic boxes of all my, staplers and the printer and everything that I need for my analog print-oriented life as an older writer. But I don't have anything unrelated to what I'm doing. So the most important process is learn to love writing so that you don't wish to be distracted from it, and then arrange not to be distracted from it.
You may have just answered this, but is there a writing habit or practice that is working for you now?
Well, that's probably the main one, subtraction and not multitasking. But another process that's worked for a while, which I think could be put into practice even if you don't happen to have a partner who's a writer, is at whatever stage you feel comfortable being able to share your writing before it goes to an editor or a publisher. And in my case, my husband, George, is a very good editor, and I don't ask him to rewrite anything, but I will often give him various choices, adjective or phrase A, B, or C, with little slashes between them. I think I become more indecisive as I get older. And maybe he's just throwing a dart, but I don't think so. I always, when he puts a check mark on one of them, I think, oh, yes, of course. How could I not have seen that? That's so much better than the other two. And then I put those things through. Now, he's very different. He shows me his work at a much earlier phase. He'll often read it aloud to me at lunch, and I will do more actual editing. Each writer needs something different. He can be also incredibly helpful to me in structural things. How should I begin this? Is this part too long? A lot of the kind of macro stuff. And knowing that you have someone like that who isn't your editor, somebody who really respects your writing, but also who holds you to a very high standard. It could be a colleague at your university. It could be a writer friend, or if, like me, you have a partner who's a writer, it could be your partner. But someone with whom you can exchange writing so that it's reciprocal and you aren't always beholden to somebody. That, I think, is great because it helps me get through the messy phase of indecision. And then I can't wait to get back to my computer and put in all that stuff. I don't need to go up to the cabin to put in all that stuff. That doesn't require any creativity. I can do that on my messy desk, which is just completely full of Yale stuff. And then I have a cleaner draft. And then, of course, I do another draft, and another draft, and another draft. But nonetheless, that helps me break through the feeling of, oh, my God, this is just a swamp. And, you have to take a machete and kind of cut through the mangroves. I have someone helping me cut through the mangroves, and every writer deserves that someone.
I agree. I mean, that feeling of getting past the mess being such a hurdle and being married to another writer is such a blessing.
Do you?
Yes,
Are you similarly fortunate?
Yeah, and we do.
And is your spouse? Do you have a similar reciprocal relationship? And do you need different kinds of things from each other? One more micro and one more macro?
We do, and I'm the one who's a little more likely to maybe read aloud, and he's pretty good at structural. That's an interesting idea, though, about giving your reader some word choices. As you were saying, he might sort of circle the one that feels most correct. But I'll have to try that. It is a real help. Thank you, Anne. This has been really fun and very interesting.
Oh, this is totally my pleasure, Rachel. I could have gone on talking with a fellow academic / fellow writer / fellow lucky enough person to be married to another writer. Could have gone on for hours. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.